You are listening to a free version of the Majority Report with Sam Steeder. To support this show and get another 15 minutes of daily program, go to majority.fm, please.
The Majority Report with Sam Steeder.
It is Monday, March 18th, 2019. My name is Sam Steeder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, anthropologist and author and fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, Jason Hickel, on The Divide, a brief guide to global inequality and its solutions. Also on the program today, Beto O'Rourke breaks the record, raises $6.1 million in a 24-hour period. His platform may take just a little bit longer
a lot
to
of
develop.
dumb people in this country.
Just to put that in context, Barack Obama made a fraction of that. And, of course, Bernie came pretty close as well. Report reveals that a GOP fundraiser was raided by federal investigators in a possible Republican money laundering probe dealing with the Trump administration.
What?
Meanwhile, the University of Tennessee offers free tuition for students of families with income of less than $50,000. Colorado gets us to 181 out of 270 in the National Popular Vote Interstate Pact. Bernie Sanders' campaign staff unionize. Trump administration assaulting the Affordable Care Act via the states. Ohio, now the latest to add Medicaid work requirements. Meanwhile, it's as easy as that. New Zealand likely to ban semi-automatic weapons. And the fascist Bolsonaro greeted by Donald Trump at White House, to the boon of comedians going on college campuses. U.S. to leave 1,000 troops in Syria. Is Mad Dog mad about that? And 1,000 reportedly killed in a Mozambique cyclone. All this and more on today's program. You'll recall that Mad Dog, I can't even remember his last name now. Mattis was fired, resigned because we were not leaving 1,000 troops in Syria. Turns out we are, and now we have no Secretary of Defense. So there's that. If I thought there was actually, I can definitely imagine a world where I would be happy that we don't have a Secretary of Defense. But I don't think that this is that world. We're living in a different world than that one. Another story I want to just highlight, just because, we talk about antitrust, people ask, how would you break up various entities? This is another example of where antitrust falls down in the United States. Spotify is suing Apple in the EU over the way that Apple treats its apps in the App Store. Right? You have a huge percentage of the market in terms of apps goes through the Apple App Store. And you cannot introduce an app that doesn't give Apple a cut of every sale that you make. And now, of course, it's not an issue with Apple Music, right, which is a competitor to Spotify. But I can tell you that part of the reason why it's taken us so long to get our app up there is because even though we were not selling memberships. We couldn't even link back to our website with the majority FM. So, without giving Apple a cut, we may end up just doing it because they seem to know that we're selling membership somewhere. And so we may end up giving them a cut, but that's like extortion, sort of. Now, I guess we could put our Apple app on a different platform if we could, but we can't. So they have created this closed system. They've gotten big enough now where some 50%, maybe more, of our audience uses an iPhone or an iPad. So this is an example of what a rigorous antitrust would do. This is anti-competitive. I don't know how you would compute whether this is cheaper for the consumer or not, but that's not the point. It is anti-competitive. It undermines innovation and broadening the economy, and of course, it consolidates political power as you increase the economic power as well. Meanwhile, on the campaign trail, as you know, Beto raised $6.1 million. He is still sort of rolling out some of his key proposals, and it's on the other end of, I don't know if this is really the other end of the spectrum, maybe on the other end of the age spectrum, but very much aligned, I think, when we talk about sort of the political lanes that exist. Beto's positions have changed quite dramatically in really just like the last term of the Obama administration, frankly. And here is another guy who's apparently his politics have also radically changed. We just haven't been able to see them in the exact same, that change as carried out. Here is Joe Biden trying to argue that he is more progressive or as progressive as every candidate in the race, the presidential race. That part of the claim is getting less attention, it seems, than his inability to hide the fact that he's running. Whatever. I mean, he had a gaffe like this that supposedly led to marriage equality, frankly, and so I'm not too concerned about him being gaffe prone, but. And maybe he made that gaffe so that he could get the other claim in without scrutiny. But let's face it, folks, this is not a guy. He should run on what he's running on, which is that he talks like your old Irish uncle, if you have one. But here he is making a speech claiming that the new left is really... They don't know what they're talking about.
I know I get criticized. I'm told I get criticized by the new left. I have the most progressive record of anybody running for the United States, if anybody who would run. I didn't mean it. With anybody who would run.
Now they're all cheering because they want him to run. And now, I just want to ask this question. I am not a Catholic, and I have seen sports figures across themselves. I don't know exactly how to do it. I don't mean to. I'm not being facetious about that. And I've seen sports figures do it as a way of thanking God. But what does Joe Biden do in these situations? He did this. He also had a similar joke with, and every time he brings up the fact that he's being criticized from the new left, I guess that means feminists. I guess that means folks who are concerned about, people of color who are concerned about his past positions on race.
Anita Hill,
I think feminists. I mean, a lot of people don't realize a lot of people don't realize there were 3 women who would have corroborated at least, if not the specific story that Anita Hill had, aspects of the behavior of Clarence Thomas that he would not allow to testify. And And people could be talking about, Social Security advocates and this and that. But I don't know who he's talking about as New Left. But he's done this before, where when he was talking about when he promoted a Republican in the 2018 election. And he said, I got criticized. And, forgive me, Father, I've sinned. And he crosses himself again. Like, are Catholics okay with him using that symbol for God as a way of because he's being sarcastic, right? Like, he's not actually asking God or his priest for forgiveness. He's basically joking like, oh, I've committed a really bad sin.
It's called the Immeditio Dei Psyche de Christi. It's a joke.
Well, but the joke he's making is I've committed a really bad sin. And so I'm going to pretend I'm asking God for forgiveness because that's how bad the sin is. Like, are Catholics? I'm just asking. I'm not a Catholic. I don't think as a Jew, if we had anything like that, it wouldn't bother me. But I wonder, are Catholics really think it's that funny that he's pretending that
Matt,
that God?
You think it's funny?
I think Catholics just would like to see the sign of the cross up there.
Right.
Yeah. You're myth. Yeah, that's my
So
instinct.
They don't care that it's like being done in vain or anything like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
Because he's clearly just doing it as like, I'm making a joke, and so I can
Catholics
keep
were
leaning
the first
on the
irony bros,
All right.
Sam.
Just checking that out. I don't know, because it occurred to me. I was like, I don't know. Is that like he's really? I get it. I get the joke.
Hey, do 5 fake Hail Marys and get out of here.
Right. There's a little bit of that. Anyways, there's Joe Biden. He has yet to announce. He will soon. Somebody suggested that he was waiting until we get past so that he doesn't have to report his fundraising until 3 months later. You got to report at the end of every quarter.
He's not a very bright individual.
It's because I'm smart.
Well, it could be a smart thing to do.
It's very fitting for him to announce his candidacy in a gaffe. So,
yes,
way to
like
stay
I say.
on brand, Joe.
I'm on brand.
Folks, has your company outgrown QuickBooks? Are shared spreadsheets, manual processes, and legacy systems costing you time and money? Introducing NetSuite by Oracle, the business management software that handles every aspect of your business in an easy-to-use cloud platform. With NetSuite, you can save time, money, and unneeded headaches by managing sales, HR, and finance and accounting instantly right from your desk or even your phone. Thousands of the best-known and fastest-growing companies use NetSuite to manage their businesses, and now it's available to you. Better yet, it's more affordable than you think. Because right now, NetSuite is offering you valuable insights to help you overcome the obstacles that are holding you back, free. Don't miss out on unleashing your business's full potential with this free guide, Crushing the 5 Barriers to Growth.
Bro. Say no more.
Michael's already on that. You'll learn how to acquire new customers, increase profits, finally get real visibility to your cash flow. Get NetSuite's guide, Crushing the 5 Barriers to Growth, Michael,
Done.
at netsuite.com/majority. Now, that's netsuite.com/majority to download their free Crushing the 5 Barriers to Growth guide today. netsuite.com/majority. Folks, want you to know that today the Majority Report is supported by Pitchfork Economics with Nick Hanauer, a weekly podcast that explores why everything you learned in Econ 101 was wrong, and why, if we don't get economics right, the pitchforks are coming. Every week on Pitchfork Economics, zillionaire investor Nick Hanauer. I don't know if he's a zillionaire, but he is a multi-millionaire. We've had him on this program a couple of times. Maybe he's a billionaire. Is joined by some of the world's most original economic thinkers in a convention-busting exploration of who gets what and why in the American economy. Pitchfork Economics explains why a $15 minimum wage is actually good for business, why taxing the rich spurs economic growth, and why a thriving middle class is the primary cause of prosperity. Senator Cory Booker explains why curbing corporate greed would actually be good for corporations and the economy. Historian Yuval Harari explains how those in power use storytelling to shrink your paycheck. And economist Stephanie Kelton scolds Democrats for worrying too much about how we're going to pay for things and not enough about what we need to do. Good for her. Saw her at the Bernie rally, incidentally. Hung out, spoke to her for a while.
Cool.
In Brooklyn. If you want to learn how to make the economy work for all Americans and not just the wealthy few, subscribe to Pitchfork Economics at pitchforkeconomics.com or wherever you get your podcasts. sometimes I quote Nick Hanauer. He was the one who said, a rich man eats only one loaf of bread a day. Harry's founders were tired of paying up for razors that were overpriced and over-designed. And that's why Harry's introduced Harry's razors. And that's why when I shave, which I try and do as little as possible, I also need a haircut, badly, I use Harry's.
There's been comments.
Yeah, have there been comments?
On the YouTube,
Yeah, I need a haircut. I know
Take your
it.
job a little bit more seriously.
I know it. But Harry's knows that a great shave doesn't come from gimmicks like vibrating heads, flex balls, or handles that look like spaceships. I'm so glad that they write that, because honestly, it looks like
true.
Rambo designed half of these shavers. So they First Blood, that's good actually. So they bought a world-class blade factory in Germany and started making razors that combine a simple, clean design with quality, durable blades at a fair price. Harry's replacement cartridges are just $2 each. And all of Harry's blades come with a 100% quality guarantee. It's no surprise that they've received over 20,000 five-star reviews on Trustpilot and Google. We're going to check out that Trustpilot. Have you ever gone there?
Mm-mm.
It's like a review site?
No.
I haven't seen that. Nevertheless, if I were to go on there and set up an account, they'd have 21,000 five-star reviews, because I would give them one. Get a $13 value trial set that comes with everything you need for a close, comfortable shave. You get the weighted ergonomic handle. You get the 5-blade razor with a lubricating strip and the, I like to think, Sam Cedar designed trimmer blade to fit in his asymmetric nostrils, the rich lathering shave gel, the travel blade cover. Listeners of my show can redeem their trial set at harrys.com/majority report. Make sure you go to harrys.com/majority report to redeem your offer. Let them know that I sent you to help support the show. All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk to Dr. Jason Hickel, author, anthropologist, and fellow at the Royal Society of Arts, who wrote a book in, I think it was 2018, on The Divide, a brief guide to global inequality and its solutions. We'll be right back after this. We are back. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Dr. Jason Hickel, an anthropologist, author, fellow at the Royal Society of Arts, and author of The Divide, a brief guide to global inequality and its solutions. Welcome to the program, Jason Hickel.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's just start with, when we talk about The Divide, give us a sense of what we're talking about internationally. Like who or what countries are on what side of what ledger, and what determines that?
Okay. So in the book that I use the terms Global North and Global South, which are kind of, I think, better these days than West and the Rest, or First World and Third World. And basically by Global North, I mean the main countries that were engaged in the colonial enterprise over the past 500 years. along with the countries of their colonial settlement, right? So not just Western Europe, but the U.S. and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So that's what I mean by the global north. And what I mean by the divide is the fact that the gap between the incomes of these global north countries, sort of the core of the world system, and the global south, has actually widened significantly since the end of colonialism. So a lot of us think that, colonialism is over since the 1950s and so on, and we live in a much fairer, more equitable global economy. But what I demonstrated, in fact, inequality has worsened significantly to the point where the per capita income gap has tripled or even quadrupled in size since the 1960s. So we live in an even more unequal world. And the reason for that, I argue, is that the global economy has been effectively organized over the past 500 years, but including today through the trade system, the debt system, the finance system, et cetera, in such a way that benefits primarily global north countries at the expense of global south countries. So that's kind of what I try to trace historically.
Okay, and
that story of inequality.
And we should just say, and I'm going to circle back to this, but we should say that the big difference between the past 50 years, some odd years, 60 some odd years, is that while this inequality has grown and whatnot, the fact is that there has been a story that it hasn't, right? And so, but let's go back, and so to that 500 years ago, where there was not this type of disparity, right? I mean, we were the global north and the global south did not have this type of disparity. What started to develop that disparity?
Yeah, it's really interesting what you say, because if we go back 500, even only 200 or 300 years, what we see is that this disparity didn't exist. A, and also B, that we see in crucial areas in the global south, we see that people are actually better off in many ways than people in the global north are, right? With longer life expectancies, better nutrition, better income, and so on. And so that's really interesting. So what we see over this period is a dramatic reversal of fortunes. And that effectively happens through the colonial process, whereby people across the global south are dispossessed from their lands, effectively rendered as sources of cheap labor for industry for the north, basically, and also sources of raw material for the Industrial Revolution. And so, what's also interesting is that the Industrial Revolution, and economic historians are clear about this, could not have happened without that colonial process. It couldn't have happened without the slave trade, without enclosure and dispossession across the South, without cotton and sugar, grown in the South, and so on. So this relationship between the North and the South was really essential for this kind of enrichment of the North. But the consequence of that was, of course, that the South was prevented from advancing in the same way.
And we should be clear here, right? Because it's not just a question of that the resources were it was the means in which the resources were taken from. This wasn't a trade. Right? I mean, when we talk about at this level, we're talking about things like slavery. We're talking about intense violence. We're talking about occupation and subjugating of indigenous people, and we're just talking about empire, really.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some key elements I think that people are not normally aware of. One is the fact that the global South was used as a kind of captive market for the overproduction of manufactured goods in the global north, right? So with the rise of industrialization in the north, what we see is that there's this immense overproduction of goods that have to find a market somewhere, and you can't have continuous growth until they do. Otherwise, you have a kind of financial crisis. And so the global South was sort of roped into being a captive market for those goods. But the only way to make that work was for colonizers to actively dismantle domestic industries in the South, right? Textile industries, and et cetera, in order to make sure that there was no competition for their goods. And this was often done, very forcibly. Like the Opium Wars are a great example of this, where Britain wanted and France wanted access to China's markets. China said, "No, we have all that we need. Thank you very much. Your goods are kind of shoddy anyway. Please go away." And Britain and France, responded by invading China and forcing their markets open to be sort of this pressure valve for their overproduced goods. So in every way, the extraction of resources on the one hand, but also on the other hand, the sale of manufactured goods. Those two elements of the Industrial Revolution depended on this violent relationship with the Global South.
So it's wealth extraction or resource extraction, and then it's also, I guess, undermining of any capacity to use their own resources, to refine their own resources to make finished goods, because they needed to be markets for those resources that have been extracted and then refined and then sold back to them.
That's right, yeah. And to me, this is a really powerful story, and one that most people are not aware of, because the dominant narrative that we have out there is that, how did the Industrial Revolution come about? Well, it happened because, you had these brilliant scientific minds in England who invented things like, the steam engine and so on, right? So, and it's only because of sort of the scientific, expertise of Englishmen, and also their good institutions and so on that industrialization was able to happen. But in fact, that's just that completely erases the relationship that England and the rest of the global North had with the South, which again it's very clear that relationship was necessary for the possibility of industrialization in the first place. And a lot of people died in that process, right? And the British intervention in India itself led to tens of millions of people who were killed needlessly due to famine, because of the way that colonizers organized their agricultural policy in order to extract cash crops from India and to feed London.
Let's talk about that a little bit more, because I've actually just done an interview that we're going to run, I think, during vacation. About that very dynamic, where the nature of that type of approach on a resource extraction ends up creating, in this case, it was the Dust Bowl in the United States, but we've had sort of Dust Bowl events around the country. But just if you could get a little bit more granular when we talk about how that resource extraction sort of functions, not only to be taken violently out of there, but also to leave the country fundamentally sort of arrested in some way because of the trauma of the way that was extracted.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take India as an example, since I was just talking about that. So when the British colonizers arrived in India, sort of their main intervention was to try to transform the agricultural system from one that was organized around subsistence, right, to one that was organized around exporting cash crops. Okay. And the way they did that basically was the problem they faced was that local people were unwilling to make this transition voluntarily because they were quite content with their existing economic arrangements, right? And so somehow they had to be coerced into making the transition. And the way that the British did that was by dispossessing them from their lands, so that they would have no choice, but to work on these kind of agribusiness farms for export. Or otherwise face starvation, or imposing sort of these debt relationships on them that required them to acquire, foreign currency in order to pay the debts back, right? Or by destroying, key social welfare mechanisms they had to make sure they were vulnerable to drought. In all of these cases, the objective was to sort of create scarcity, to sort of induce the threat of hunger, and that would drive people into the capitalist labor market. And that same process unfolded not only in India but across most of the global South, and that's what we call enclosure. And that was a key dynamic for that process of extraction.
Now, is that how sort of calculated is that, or is it simply like we go in, we have a narrow agenda, we find that it leads to X, Y, and Z? Or how much of it is that sort of like a calculated idea when the colonial powers enter a country?
Oh yeah, it was very calculated actually, and we can see this in the writings of key theorists of the colonial encounter actually, right? So, and interestingly, the idea was first developed in England during the enclosure period in the medieval years. And the idea there was, again, we can force peasants to sort of compete with each other and be productive on enclosed farms for rich people by putting them at the mercy of hunger, right? So taking away their access to the commons, to land and to forests and to fish and game and so on. And so the exact same process was used then in Ireland, which was the first British colony, but then also in India and across southern Africa, and not just by the British, but by other colonizers as well. And the consequences were devastating. And this is important because we have this, again, there's another narrative out there that colonialism was in some way kind of an economic benefit to the colonized. But exactly the opposite is true. And again, if we take India.
Jason, I'm sorry. Can you just speak a little bit more directly into the phone? We're just losing you a little bit.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah.
That's it. Okay.
So again, if we take India, we see that there's zero increase in real per capita income during the colonial period, the entire 200-year period of British rule, right? And there's actually a decline in life expectancy in the latter part of British rule, et cetera. So we really see that colonization depleted the lives of the colonized in crucial ways, but for the sake of of the development of the North. And that process played out all over the world.
And we should say that to be subjected to this over the course of 200 years, you are fundamentally altering the culture, right? You're fundamentally altering the trajectory of the life of that country.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And one of the clearest ways we see that is the sheer mass of extracted wealth that was drained from the global South, right? So with India alone, to use this example again, Britain drained in the region of $45 trillion from India during the colonial period. Now that is money that they could have used not only for their own incomes and well-being, but for reinvestment in development, right? In the same way that Japan was able to use their own foreign exchange earnings to build up a robust, rich economy. So too, India could have done the same thing, but they were prevented from doing so over hundreds of years, for the sake of extraction to the north.
Okay, so that story is one. That's the story of India, but that story is essentially one that plays out across the global South, as it were.
That's right. We see the same story happening across Africa, happening across Latin America. And again, it's not just Britain, but also other colonizers use the same tactics effectively. That's
okay,
right.
So then
now what's interesting.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, please.
I was going to say what's interesting is what happens after the end of colonization, though, because the story really does change quite dramatically.
Right. Well, that's where I wanted to go. So then we get to this era in I guess presumably in the 1950s. Which we start to recognize as a post-colonization era. And theoretically, right, this is all ended, but no.
Oh, well, what's interesting is we have a couple of decades in the wake of decolonization that are actually pretty extraordinary. So you have these newly independent nations with democratically elected governments that were, on the whole, quite progressive, right? They were more or less, leftist progressive governments, and they were rolling out what we call developmentalist reforms. They were reversing all of the structures that had existed under colonialism. So they were redistributing lands to make sure that peasants had access to the land they needed to grow food. They were improving labor rights and improving wages. They were introducing capital controls to prevent capital flight from multinational companies. They were investing in public services like healthcare and education. They were nationalizing key resources like oil and gold and things like that. And it was working really, really well. During the 50s, 60s, and 70s, per capita income grew at an astonishing rate, 3.2% per year. They succeeded in beginning to reduce poverty. They were closing the gap between the global South and the global North. It was really an extraordinary era. And I think that, we've forgotten about that too easily. And not only that, but global South countries were uniting with one another to build bonds of solidarity, to argue for a fair global economy in the UN. And in 1973, managed to pass this extraordinary document called the New International Economic Order, which demanded effectively that they be allowed to control their own economic policy and their own national interests without fear of being invaded and recolonized by global North countries. It was an extraordinary time. But what's interesting about this is that global North countries, the former colonizers, were not at all happy about it, as you can imagine, because they're suddenly losing their access to the cheap labor and cheap raw materials and open markets that they had secured during the colonial period. And so they reacted by, in many cases, violently deposing these progressive governments, one after the other, on many occasions through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Trying to reverse their progressive policies and restore their access to the cheap labor and raw materials they enjoyed under colonialism.
Okay,
and in many cases,
go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
In many cases, the U.S. was actually was instrumental in this. Actually, this is where the U.S.'s role as a kind of neo-colonial power becomes really crucial. Like the U.S. was behind the coup that deposed the progressive leader of Iran, the first democratically elected progressive leader of Iran. They were behind a number of coups across Latin America, including in Guatemala, in Brazil. They were behind the coup that deposed Sukarno in Indonesia, and Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. Over and over again, the U.S. joined forces with former colonial nations to depose progressive leaders and roll back their economic reforms.
And we should say that often this is in conjunction with very specific corporate interests in the various regions, right? Like when we talk about Central America, you had the United Fruit Company or ITT and oil companies in Iran, and these were all. They were all basically they were all corporate interests that drove this, because presumably they're the ones who are on the front lines of getting these natural resources, extracting these natural resources, and then theoretically, I guess, selling it back to these places.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the progressive policies that I was talking about, quite often directly negatively affected American companies, right? So land reform, affected American fruit companies that had these enormous land holdings, most of which were not even used, but they held them nonetheless. And so when those were redistributed back to the peasants from whom they were taken, the fruit companies were obviously extremely upset. The same is true of, telecommunications companies that had been controlled by U.S. companies, oil, et cetera. So when these companies and resources were nationalized, then the American companies that used to hold those resources, those assets, were obviously pissed off. And so they went to the CIA and they said, look, we need your help in sort of deposing these progressive leaders. And, honestly, I think that it's a real shame that Americans have forgotten about this era. This incredibly destructive legacy of coup-mongering, right? And it's important to remember, because it's one of the reasons why people in the Global South, do have anti-American sentiments, right? Because their democratically elected leaders who promised, justice for their people in the wake of colonialism, were overthrown and replaced by vicious dictators that were backed by the U.S. and former colonial powers, right? When Patrice Lumumba, the first elected leader of the Congo, was assassinated in 1961 by the U.S., he was replaced by Mobutu, a cartoonishly violent dictator who controlled the country in American interest for the next 30 years and just drove it completely into the ground. I mean, that makes people, embittered and angry.
I mean, the amazing thing, too, about this part of the story is that we go around the world and look at places that are, problematic in some. Look, everywhere is problematic, but sort of like in sort of arguably crisis, right? We overthrow Mossadegh 60, 70 years ago, and we're still talking about Iran today as perhaps invading them. We talk about the destabilization in Central America, and everything in the news today is about kids, families, even cops trying to get out of these countries because of the level of violence, the destabilization. We have this ongoing thing in Venezuela that is eerily similar as Guaido announces that he's getting ready to somehow he's going to reprivatize the oil companies. I mean, so this is a playlet that we that has long-term repercussions. So what happens after that era where we attempt to sort of like recolonize, sort of a soft recolonization, I guess? We get to just another even softer recolonization than that, right?
Yeah. So what happens after this period is that in 1980 there's basically a global debt crisis that's triggered by the fact that the chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, dramatically raises interest rates on the U.S. dollar, and because most global South loans at the time were denominated in dollars, this makes their debts basically unpayable. And so, we're talking about interest rates of like 20%. And so they slid to the brink of default. And Western banks, which were overexposed to these toxic debts, were like, look, if they default, then we're going to collapse, and we can't let that happen. So they went to the U.S. government and said, look, what can you do to help us? And the U.S. government bailed them out, by forcing global South countries to cut public spending, to privatize their resources, and use all of that money to pay back debts. So global South countries were basically plundered for the sake of debt repayment to these overexposed, bankrupt banks on Wall Street. This is very similar to what happened in 2008, and it's important. It's important to understand that this tactic was first tried in the 1980s very effectively, and what this did is it, in one fell swoop, allowed creditor countries like the U.S. Through the World Bank and the IMF to control economic policy in global South countries, forcing them to roll back their developmentalist reforms that had been so successful for them, denying them the very policies they needed for real development and poverty reduction. And as a consequence, what we saw during the 80s and 90s was a massive contraction in the economies across the global South that were subjected to structural adjustment. And that caused poverty rates to go up really dramatically. I mean, it was a devastating time where we see poverty and hunger rising during the structural adjustment period. And this again is something that Americans have really unfortunately forgotten about, the role that their government played through the World Bank and the IMF, along with other rich nations, in reversing the progress that global South countries have made in the previous decades.
And again, it is very much like the housing crisis. You lead these countries into a situation where they become overextended, and the bailout could have happened directly to them, but instead it happens to the banks under the requirements that they sell off all their assets, do a short sale on their homes, I guess, would be the analogy on some level. And in some instances also are forced to sort of basically build these big infrastructure boondoggles that promise to use American financed companies, right? Like these banks turn around, they're like, we're going to make another loan for you to build this dam that we're going to pay off of.
That's right.
You're going to get paid for monies that we're giving to these countries in response for them cutting services, essentially.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I think the subprime analogy here is really apt, actually. And it's important to realize that the U.S. and Western Europe took this opportunity to impose Washington consensus neoliberal policy across the global South, which they were unable to do before because democracies would always reject it. And so this is how globalization came about. It was forcibly imposed on the world through structural adjustments. So there are some parts of the world that were not structurally adjusted, like East Asia and China, were allowed to retain their earlier policies of basically state-led development with remarkable success, right? So the countries that have actually succeeded in dramatically reducing poverty, like Taiwan, like China, like South Korea, have followed a completely different path, a path that was actively denied to the rest of the global South. And I think that's really important to understand.
All right, and one of the things that you tackle is the idea that, in fact, we have lowered that we have lowered global poverty, and you basically argue that this is we've lowered the number, but not the actuality of poverty. Explain that.
Yeah, so it's actually a bit different than that. But let me start with the dominant narrative that's out there that we hear from people like Bill Gates and Steve Pinker, who are all over the place saying that basically poverty is being eradicated, being reduced really quickly, and it's all thanks to neoliberal globalization. Like, yes, maybe it's causing a bit more inequality, but at least we know that it's working against poverty, and so therefore it justifies the global economy as it is, and we should carry on in the status quo. Now, the only way that narrative works is by relying on an extremely low poverty line of $1.90 per day. Okay, it's so low that it's actually impossible to have any kind of meaningful existence on that amount of money at all. I mean, imagine yourself trying to live on $1.90 a day. I mean, that's literally what it is. It's what $1.90 a day buys in the U.S. So what we know from piles of research is that people need, at minimum about $7.40 a day to sort of achieve basic nutrition, normal human life expectancy, a decent shot of surviving their 5th birthday, etc. And now, if we measure poverty at that level around the world, then what we see is that the story changes completely. In fact, the number of people in poverty below that line has increased dramatically since the 1980s and now stands at 4.2 billion people, or about 60% of the human population, which is 6 times higher than what people like Gates and Pinker would have us believe. And with figures like this on the table, it becomes abundantly clear that the global economy is, in fact, not working for the majority of humanity, and is deeply unfair and needs to be changed. But that's a narrative that people like Pinker and Gates cannot abide.
Sorry, so how is that the case? I mean, how is it that we don't hear more of this? I mean, how is it that what constitutes poverty is really is just simply an absurd figure to assess?
Yeah, it's completely absurd. In fact, even the World Bank that produces the $1.90 a day line itself warns over and over that it is not adequate to inform policy, right? That we shouldn't really take it seriously for most countries in the world, maybe only for the very poorest. And yet we do, because it's powerful, and journalists keep repeating it because it tells such a powerful, happy story, a rosy narrative about what's happening to the economy. When in fact the reality is much darker. It's true that people's incomes have been increasing, but only by pennies, and not nearly enough to actually lift them out of poverty according to any meaningful definition. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that during the same period, the income captured by the global 1% has absolutely skyrocketed to the point where the 1% now controls in the region of 18 or 19 trillion US dollars themselves. Now, even just 1/3 of that would be enough to end global poverty at a high poverty line forever, right? 1/3. And it would still leave the global 1% with nearly $200,000 on average in income per year, right? So effectively, all of the new income generated by global growth over the past few decades has been captured by the richest of the world. And the poorest have received literally, pennies on the dollar in terms of trickle down. It truly is an injustice, especially when you consider the fact that it's the global south from which the world gets most of its resources and most of its labor. The people that are contributing to the global economy most are the ones who are being paid by far the least and living in poverty.
So basically, the story is that we have been sold, if we have global growth, that the pie is going to expand. It's true that an uneven amount will be distributed to those at the top, but those at the bottom will get stuff. And what they basically did was lowered the threshold enough so that every small penny that came in looked that much of a larger of a percentage of increase as to the bottom line. I mean, it's as if basically saying we want to raise the age of everybody in the country. And so what we're going to do is, we're going to let time go, and we're just going to measure kids' years in months. And so look at they're getting so much older, and we're going to keep
basically right.
We're going to measure adults years and years, and they're getting so much older, these kids, and they're really picking up the speed. And then we define being a teenager as being 36 months. And we have all these teenagers now because they enter teenage, in year 3 or 4. I mean, that's just the way that's just an analogy for people to sort of just see the way that this income or wealth is distributed here. So, okay. So with this, what would be, and you have a significant portion of the book dedicated towards fixing this, but it seems to me that like one of the first things you would need to do is actually present the real numbers for people. I mean, to widely disseminate that. Yeah. But after that, what's next?
Yeah, good question. So in the book, I go through a number of different policy proposals that are completely feasible and easy to implement if we just had the political will, which is basically the real problem. But one of the main things I point out here is the fact that right now the institutions that control the rules of the global economy, like the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, are deeply anti-democratic institutions where the U.S. holds veto power over all major decisions. And the Global South, which has 85% of the world's population, has less than 50% of the vote. And this is kind of a global apartheid at the very center of, macroeconomic institutions, which we would never accept if it was in any normal country. So the first step is to democratize the institutions that control the global economy to make sure that poor countries have a fair voice in them. On top of that, I think we need to start talking about what a global minimum wage would look like, right? I mean, if capitalism is globalized, then it stands to reason that we need to globalize this, the rules that protect people from it. And so I propose what a global minimum wage might look like. That would be pegged at 50% of each country's minimum income, median income. So it would fluctuate depending on each country's level of development, and therefore not cause too much disruption. And this would massively increase the share of the global economy that poor people in poor countries are able to capture for the work they put into it. Other ideas include we need to clamp down on tax evasion and illicit financial flows, by which multinational companies, most of them headquartered in the West, extract in the region of $1 trillion plus US dollars per year from the Global South, a massive outflow of wealth from south to north that vastly outstrips any meager amount of aid that trickles the other direction. So, and then also, crucially, I guess the last thing I would say is the importance of canceling, some of these old unpayable debts, these old odious debts, and thereby releasing poor countries from policy control by rich creditors and allowing them to use their own budgets for healthcare and education, improving the quality of life of the population. So these solutions are fundamentally different from what we normally think about. Normally we think, they just, poor countries need a bit more aid here and there, a few technological fixes maybe. What I argue instead is that what they need is not charity, but rather justice. We have to fundamentally change the rules of the global economy to make it fair for the world's majority.
So lastly, let me ask you this. If it is simply ultimately a question of political will, and presumably the countries like the United States have more than their share of the political will that is distributed, right? Because they want to maintain it. It's like, what is the pitch? What do we tell the American public in terms of why, to the extent that, and presumably the American public has a disproportionate share of the responsibility for that political will, right? On how that political will gets manifested. What do we tell the American public? Is it simply a case of this is justice, or is there a material argument to be made as well?
I think that people on some level are very deeply uncomfortable with the fact that we all know that the goods that we consume have a devastating impact on people's lives, in the sense of our clothes are made by people in sweatshops, our smartphones, include minerals produced by effectively slaves in the Congo, et cetera. I mean, this makes us feel horrible about ourselves. On some deep level, I think it depresses us, it dehumanizes us. I think that we have a lot to gain, I guess spiritually, if you will, from living in an economy, a global economy that is fundamentally fair. I think that we would be happier and have a better sense of we're in solidarity with our fellow humans. I think there's a lot to gain from that in the terms of recovering our humanity after 500 years of plunder. So, and I think it's crucial that we pay close attention to the foreign policy platforms of the presidents and other representatives that we elect. Right? I mean, we can elect people that will change these rules. We can elect people that will bring about not just a fair economy in the U.S., but also in the world system itself. The U.S. has an incredible amount of bargaining power, on the stage of the world system, and can change things. And if we manage to elect people that have the will to do that, then that would be very powerful. And I think people like Bernie Sanders and AOC are people who are in that camp.
Jason Hickel, the book is The Divide, A Brief Guide to Global Inequality and Its Solutions. Thanks so much for your time today. We'll put a link to The Divide at majorityradio.com. Thanks again for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Sam.
Bye-bye. There you have it, folks.
Take that, Steven Pinker.
Right. And it really is stunning, the amount of what we perceive as foreign policy problems in this country that we discuss on a near daily basis that are a function of our foreign policy. Like, as if these things just sort of, popped up out of nowhere. It is, and the analogy between our relationship with the global South and, frankly, it may not even be an analogy as much as it's an extension, or it's in a different, it's a different facet of our relationship with the global South relative to our relationship in this country between people of color and the white power structure and the notion of white supremacy. I mean, these things probably are not as much analogous as they are of the same species, and just simply a different sort of part of the problem.
Yeah, and if you go back even further to the kind of primitive accumulation that he was talking about, you see very explicitly how these things are connected to early capitalist development.
Indeed. All right. Well, let's take a quick break and head into the fun half. Before we do, as you remember, I mentioned earlier, the Majority Report is this episode is supported by Pitchfork Economics with Nick Hanauer, weekly podcast that explores why rising income inequality will lead to pitchforks and what we can do about it. Every week, Hanauer is joined by some of the world's most original economic thinkers in a convention-busting exploration of who gets what and why in the American economy. If you want to learn how to make the economy work for all Americans, subscribe to Pitchfork Economics at pitchforkeconomics.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And speaking of podcasts, you can become a member of this podcast, and you can support this show by going to jointhemajorityreport.com. Every day, we try and bring you either a in-depth interview that will have you have a greater understanding of a narrow part of our political landscape. And so at the end of a year or month or years, you will have a far greater understanding of how these things connect. I sort of feel like, I mean, having spoken to, we have a pre-recorded interview that we did for we're going to run, I think, in April on the Dust Bowl and sort of the capitalist practices that bring about sort of the economic devastation in a place like the Dust Bowl, and how we see that same dynamic play out in as Jason Hickel was explaining in India, and see this all throughout the world. I almost feel like we need like one day a year we do 24-hour podcast where we just sort of like show the connections between these shows, rather than having to sort of like, who's got the time to put it all together? Do you know what I'm saying?
I trust the audience to do that.
Well, you got to take. I guess that's what the weekends are for,
right?
And so people
We
should
gotta
be
get
sitting
you a
down.
blackboard. That's what Brendan said. That's a good idea.
Yeah, it's a big blackboard.
Yeah.
It's going to be a big blackboard. Get a huge. There's also you could probably do something with like a TV where you could have like a rolling blackboard. So as you pretend like you're stepping to the right, the TV is actually the thing that's moving. Yes.
Don't tell Glenn Beck about this.
Right. Anyways, folks, that was a little bit of a detour in my saying that you can support this program, which attempts to provide that rolling blackboard every day by going to jointhemajorityreport.com. Also, don't forget to support justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Coupon code majority, get 10% off. I want to thank those guys for sending me a poster of our Majority Report blend coffee. We're going to frame that bad boy and hang it in the office proudly. But you go over there, you can get the Majority Report blend, you get any other type of coffee, and it's all fair trade. It's a great company, co-op owned. And today is Monday. Michael's here. That's weird. And tomorrow is Tuesday.
Doing here.
It's 2 in a row.
It's two in a row. It is 2 in a row.
Excuse me, guys.
Full on streak.
Yeah. I don't really feel so great, though. So
No, I am exhausted.
Have a good fun.
I'm exhausted. I had a horrible bout of heartburn last night. It kept me up for like 3 or 4 hours.
That is a very
pipes quiet?
Semitic trait that Sam has.
I wasn't at the. I wasn't with
you
the
walk
kids
in and
last
Sam
night, so
goes,
no
"How
pipes.
you doing, man? How you doing? Good morning." You go, "It was a good." I'll tell you how my weekend was. I had heartburn and I couldn't sleep, and my kids, and you're just like, "Oh my God, Jesus Christ!"
I didn't
that
complain
sounds
about my
bad.
kids. I was
And
not
then-
with the kids.
And
this
then I
weekend.
wasn't with the kids because that's the heartburn week, and then next week will be a kid and
Right,
pipe
exactly.
week, and then it's no sleep either way.
Right.
Did you see this?
That's what he starts showing you sound he's excited about.
That's the behind the scenes, folks.
Did you see what Howard Schultz said?
We should
Play
really-
it again.
We should really
Play it again.
We should really be saving that for the fun half. That great behind the scenes stuff for the fun half.
Play it again.
Giving it away for
Tomorrow
free.
on the Michael Brooks Show, Harvey J.K. and Daniel Bessner are joining us both in studio. There's going to be a internal left debate on American exceptionalism and a discussion of how the right wing suppresses American progressive history as well as democracy and foreign policy. And, of course, a whole bunch of other stuff. You can stream it live on our YouTube channel, Michael Brooks Show on YouTube. Thanks to our first 34,000 subscribers there, and get the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS. See you tomorrow around 7-ish.
We should get Harvey K into Majority Report one of these days, too.
Definitely.
Jamie, the Intifada.
So we actually released this on Friday. It was going to be a bonus for patrons, but
Good episode.
Thank you. In light of recent events, we decided to release it without the paywall. In this edition of History is a Weapon, Sean and Matt Christman from Chapo Trap House go deep into French history to explain where nationalism and right-wing populism and white nationalism all come from. France was first in a lot of things, and they were first in that, unfortunately. And they do this through the lens of a book called The Camp of the Saints, which was written in the 1970s as sort of an immigrant panic. And it's still very relevant because it provides a lot of the ideological framework for people like Marine Le Pen and Steve Bannon. So they kind of connect the dots. If anyone wants to know more about how bourgeois society crumbles into fascism, please listen to this episode.
Matt.
King Philip's War, or Metacomet's Rebellion, as we call it, and the captivity narrative of Mary Rowlandson released this weekend. I'll sell you on it, Sam. The King Philip's War has 2 elements you're interested in. Generational conflict, because Metacomet realized that, and some zero-sumness. So Metacomet
Here we go.
realizes that the older sachems were basically not fighting, like they're settling all the land that the younger generation wanted to like have sort of control over, and they're like, well, the younger sachems are like, no, we're going to fight these guys now. So
Actual generational war.
well, they didn't fight the older generation. They just decided to fight the colonists.
That's exactly how the staff jobs at NBC were. All listen.
Wait, what was the zero-sum part?
The land.
Right,
Yeah.
there you go. All right, folks, quick break. Headed
Good
to the fun half. See you there. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous? You're a little bit upset? You're riled up?
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that. You fuck.